This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome to part 3 of our presentation on the authorship of Isaiah. We're going to talk about bias and plausibility structures in biblical scholarship. And let's begin by talking about the power of bias. There are many biases that influence the works of biblical scholars. Among them are the following. Availability cascade, which is a self-reinforcing process in which a collective belief gains more and more plausibility through its increasing repetition in public discourse. In other words, repeat something long enough and it will become true. A good example from the field of biblical studies is this idea that prophets are forth-tellers, not foretellers. And that's related to that quote in segment 1 from Stephen Mackenzie. This is a theological and religious claim. It's not arising from any objective analysis of data. Another example of bias is belief bias, an effect where someone's evaluation of the logical strength of an argument is biased by the believability of the conclusion. An example would be to say a prophet could not have predicted X. Therefore, this could not have been written by the attributed prophet. Another example of bias is experimenters or expectation bias, the tendency for experimenters to believe, certify, and publish data that agree with their expectations for the outcome of an experiment, and to disbelieve, discard, or downgrade the corresponding weightings for data that appear to conflict with those expectations. An example, I expect to see multiple authors because scholarly consensus, assumptions about prophecy, etc. So I see multiple authors, and I dismiss arguments for authorial unity. And we're going to see an example of this with a case study using the work of Marvin Sweeney and Shalom Paul. Another example of bias is groupthink or bandwagoning, a psychological phenomenon that occurs within a group of people in which the desire for harmony or conformity in the group results in an irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome. Group members try to minimize conflict and reach a consensus decision without critical evaluation of alternative viewpoints, by actively suppressing dissenting viewpoints, and by isolating themselves from outside influences. Example, the consensus on X is a reliable guide to objective truth, and other views are to be disregarded as fringe, their proponents excluded from the circle of real scholars. Some other forms of bias are our isms, like positivism or empiricism or naturalism or scientism or reductionism. And I have a link here to a more lengthy discussion of our common biases. And that's at Nauvoo Neighbor. It's called We're All Biased. So if you want to research that in a little more depth, I recommend that resource. Now here is an interesting form of bias, and it's a religious bias and kind of a tendency toward dogmatism. Let's look at this. Here is a quote from Jacques Berliner Blau. He says, "The unspeakable that I allude to in my title concerns what we might label the demographic peculiarities of the academic discipline of biblical scholarship. Addressing this very issue 30 years ago, M.H. Goshen-Gottstein observed, however we try to ignore it, practically all of us are in it because we are either Christians or Jews. In the intervening decades, very little has changed. Biblicists continue to be professing, or once professing, Christians and Jews. They continue to ignore the fact that the relation between their own religious commitments and their scholarly subject matter is wont to generate every imaginable conflict of intellectual interest. 2, they still seem oblivious to how strange this state of affairs strikes their colleagues in the humanities and social sciences. What results is a situation in which biblical scholarship's secular wing is more like a reformed religious or liberal religious wing." Think about what he's saying here and how the experience of religion, whether that is a positive continual experience of religion or an experience of disillusionment with religion and disillusionment with one's faith. Think about how those things are going to bias a scholar. And that bias is not really avoidable. It's going to creep up in their studies, in their research, regardless of how they try to account for it. Here's an interesting quote from the Anchor Bible commentary on the book of Amos. Since the basic work of Bernhard Doom and Julius Wellhausen, certain passages and phrases in the book of Amos have been marked off as not the work of the prophet himself. They were not included in the work until after his time, after the first publication, some being added quite late in its literary development. T.K. Shane, W.R. Harper, and S.R. Driver were responsible for spreading these ideas to English readers, and George Adam Smith popularized them, making such observations respectable even for preachers. Each scholar has his own list, for there is no surefire technique for distinguishing authentic Amos materials from the additions of later scribes, and each investigator arrives at his conclusions with various degrees of confidence, ranging from perhaps to dogmatic certainty. So let's unpack this a little bit. Each scholar has his own list, for there is no surefire technique for distinguishing authentic Amos materials. Okay? If each scholar has his own list, that means there's a very subjective process at work. And yet, they say that these scholars sometimes speak with dogmatic certainty. Why would a scholar speak with dogmatic certainty about a very subjective process that reflects the biases of each individual scholar? Well, a dogmatic personality is going to be at work in their scholarship, even in situations where there's a lot of ambiguity. And a dogmatic personality is just a very low tolerance for ambiguity. It's a desire to have complete certitude about everything and speak with finality and not have things challenged. So this is a really common bias in the field of biblical studies. If you read biblical commentaries, and especially Isaiah commentaries, you will see this at work. A lot of scholars make very, very firm dogmatic pronouncements, and then you'll read several other commentaries where scholars are very tentative in the conclusions that they speak of. So again, a dogmatic personality type amounts to a very, very powerful form of bias in a scholar's work. And now let's look at Jeffrey Morrow on bias in scholarly method. He says, in the first place, it is impossible to approach the interpretation of any text, let alone one so theologically charged, and with such demands of personal investment as the Bible, with complete objective neutrality, that is, without any prior assumptions. Certain biases within biblical studies, however, seem to be unrecognized or under-recognized by scholars. Here I want to discuss a few of these biases that have crept into the very methods themselves, as starting points or basic assumptions. In many cases, these represented the particular biases of the pioneering scholars who played a role in developing the methods we study, use, and teach. Individual scholars using these methods today might not share the same biases, but these assumptions have become inherent in the methods and scholarly hypotheses themselves. This might be one of the reasons why these particular biases are not getting more recognition today. They are not shared by the scholars using the methods and assuming the hypotheses, which were themselves shaped by the fundamental guiding assumptions that the researchers and teachers no longer realize nor share with the historical initiators of the method. This is interesting. Look at what he says here. A few of these biases that have crept into the very methods themselves as starting points or basic assumptions. That's incredibly important. A scholar may claim to be unbiased in a particular way. A scholar might, for example, say, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, like some previous European scholars were, right? But what if those anti-Semitic European scholars infused the scholarly method with their anti-Semitic assumptions about the world, their anti-Semitic worldview? He's saying that scholars need to be aware that scholarly methods are, in fact, infused with assumptions. And some of those assumptions are not good ones. As I mentioned, anti-Semitism is one of those. Stacy Davis says, more than a decade later, when I taught my first Leviticus and Numbers course, I returned to Wellhausen as an example of early scholarly dismissal of the priestly texts as late for non-scholarly reasons. Additionally, that example, which seemed so clear to my 20-something and now 40-something mind, hardly receives a mention in scholarly analysis of Wellhausen, particularly by Hebrew Bible scholars. This is in part due to unapologetic apologetics regarding Wellhausen's bias, combined with the insistence that a 19th century German scholar cannot be judged by 21st century definitions of bias. These calls for compassion toward Wellhausen are made exclusively by white, male, non-Jewish scholars, leaving Jewish scholars the unenviable task of pointing out Wellhausen's anti-Judaism. In an overwhelmingly white, male, and Christian academic field, the minimizing of Wellhausen's bias creates a two-pronged double standard. First, contextual biblical studies done by women and PGM, people of the global majority, can be criticized for lack of objectivity, while Wellhausen's context offers a defense for his bias, without recognizing the growing anti-Judaism and nationalism within 19th century Germany. Again, Wellhausen, one of the foundational scholars influencing even contemporary biblical scholarship, if his biases crept into his methods, and those methods are being propagated for decades and decades and decades, obviously that's a problem of bias in biblical studies, even among scholars who are not anti-Semitic. Now let's look at an example of bias in biblical scholarship, and let's do a case study from Isaiah scholarship. Here are some passages from Isaiah commentaries by Marvin Sweeney and Shalom Paul. These are world-class Isaiah scholars. And these scholars have differing views on the setting for some passages in Isaiah. And let's look at how their biases are manifest in their scholarship. Marvin Sweeney is talking about Isaiah 42, and he says, "Indeed, the concluding hymn in 42, 10 through 13, suggests a temple, or at least a temple site setting. Insofar as scholars know of no liturgical setting used by Jews in Babylonia, the site of the temple, whether rebuilt or not, would provide an appropriate setting for the liturgical performance of the book of Isaiah." So Sweeney here is saying that this passage was performed either in the temple or at the temple site following the exile. Shalom Paul disagrees, and let's look at what he does here. He's talking about the same passage, and he says, "An ode to God for the imminent salvation from the Babylonian exile." In other words, he's arguing that this is not a post-exilic passage. He says, "Just as Israel sang to God when he parted the Reed Sea, so too they will sing as God leads them through the Syrian desert to the promised land. And this time the mountains, the oceans, and the desert, all of nature in fact, will join Israel in their joyous hymn of thanksgiving." The first three verses of the ode reverberate with imagery from Psalms 96 and 98. These scholars have approached their work with different assumptions about the setting for these passages in Isaiah, and they're able to offer defenses of conclusions they already arrived at before they did this work. And we'll see, as we progress along, more examples of this. Here we have a discussion of Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58 is one of my favorite passages in Scripture. It's the chapter of Isaiah that really focuses on fasting. Sweeney says Isaiah 58 presupposes the observance of fast days, which would be an important feature of temple worship. Again, he's saying that these passages have a temple context, right? He says, particularly at Yom Kippur and other fast days in the Jewish tradition, the observance of such fasts and Shabbat therefore points to the period following the rebuilding of the temple, when the people were becoming more and more accustomed to participating in the temple's liturgy and observances. The passage also presupposes that religious instruction is taking place, insofar as it goes to special efforts to instruct the people in proper moral action and the value of social justice. Shalom Paul says, or not, the greater part of this chapter is dedicated to a socio-moral admonishment against the nation's conduct, specifically their lack of abstinence from commerce on communal fast days. The reference is most likely to the Day of Atonement. See below. Call with a full throat, and then he offers an Akkadian cognate. And in these passages that I've highlighted in red, you can see Shalom Paul providing some evidences for his view against Sweeney's view, and he's trying to argue for his view of a Babylonian context, not a post-exilic temple context for these passages, using some analogs from Mesopotamia and Akkadian language and so on and so forth. You can see you have two scholars with very different agendas in mind, very different biases, and looking at evidence in very biased ways. And that's how they arrive at their different conclusions. Here again, in this passage, we're talking about Isaiah 60. And Sweeney says Isaiah 60 announces restoration for Zion as a result of the restoration of the Jerusalem temple. The passage was composed to celebrate the rebuilding and dedication of the temple in the 6th century BCE. It thereby serves as the literary culmination of the 6th century edition of the book of Isaiah. Shalom Paul disagrees. He says chapter 60 is composed of one interrupted eschatological prophecy delineating a plan for the rehabilitation, reconstruction, and all-pervasive glory of future Jerusalem. And again, here he uses Mesopotamian inscriptions to argue for his view that this is an exilic passage. Once again, here are two scholars who have different views for the settings of these passages, and they're evaluating evidence according to their own biases. Finally, Isaiah 61 to 62. Marvin Sweeney says this constitutes the prophet's presentation of the speech of an anointed figure. The unit begins in 61:1, in which the anointed figure begins with a first-person speech in verses 1 through 4 that announces his anointing by Yahweh and his commission to proclaim good tidings to the people of Jerusalem and Judah. Although the first-person form of the speech indicates that the anointed one is the speaker, the larger context in chapters 60 through 62 indicates that the prophet is the one who transmits the anointed one's speech. Below, he says, although a first-person address form appears in 64:7, it is no longer clear that the anointed figure of 61:1 to 62:12 is the speaker. Let's see what Shalom Paul says. In the first 3 verses of the first pericope, Deutero-Isaiah's appointment to prophecy is described in the first person, and his mission delineated. God has anointed him. Again, very, very different conclusions that they arrive at because they are operating from a standpoint of bias. Here's a really great quote from John Oswalt from his commentary on Isaiah. He says, yet another argument that must be lodged against the hypothesis of multiple authorship of Isaiah is the fact that it has not been able to produce any unanimity of results. He says, while the work of Holliday noted above is one example of how the process is supposed to have worked, there would be almost no scholar who would agree with many of the details of his contentions. Although biblical studies are far from being an exact science, it is still true that if a methodology is correct, it ought to yield substantially similar results in the hands of different researchers. In fact, that is not the case with the study of Isaiah. 2 commentators who both share a commitment to form criticism and to multiple authorship of Isaiah may vary by as much as 300 years as to when a particular unit was written. They would disagree just as widely on the literary relation of that unit to those around it. There is something wrong with a methodology that cannot yield more predictable results. And here's Benjamin Summer, another Isaiah scholar, and he's talking about the work of Ronald Clements. He says, I find Clements' essay to be wondrously compelling, yet it is the product of his own subtle and sophisticated imagination, through which he has created a picture of what these redactors did. There are no marginal notes in the manuscripts explaining that this is how the text came to be. We have only the text. Clements' fertile imagination has created for us an almost psychological portrayal of the thought processes of these exilic and post-exilic redactors. We might ask whether Clements has discovered a past reality or whether he has created it. Summer continues, commenting on the work of a couple of other scholars. He says, what we should conclude from this is not necessarily that Shepard proposes a truer representation of structure than Sweeney, but rather that Sweeney decided how he would represent structure. One may indeed ask whether Sweeney has discovered the structure of the book of Isaiah, or whether he has instead created a particular way of doing structural analysis. Moreover, if meaning is thought to be related to structure, one may ask to what extent Sweeney's interpretation of the intentions of the final redactor of Isaiah is a discovery of a past meaning, or to what extent it is a creation of Sweeney the interpreter. This is a really interesting analysis from Benjamin Summer. He's saying that these scholars' biases are so powerful that they really amount to a creative force, creating things that really don't actually exist. And here's a really important concept to understand about bias. Bias can take the form of a lack of a personal stake in a question. Here's Rabbi J.H. Hertz in the Encyclopedia Judaica. He says the authorship of Isaiah can be considered dispassionately. It touches no dogma or any religious principle in Judaism, and moreover does not materially affect the understanding of the prophecies or of the human conditions of the Jewish people that they have in view. This is really interesting for him to say. What he's really saying here is that Jews don't really have a dog in the fight when it comes to questions around the authorship of Isaiah. Well, why is that important? Because when you don't feel like you have a strong interest in a question, you're not going to ask hard questions or push back on things. A good example of that might be questions around the organization of the book of Jeremiah in the Septuagint, okay? Latter-day Saints don't really have a serious interest in that kind of a question. So when scholars offer their views on that question, we are not likely to really push back. We're going to be likely to just let people think whatever they want to think, right? Now, when it comes to the authorship of Isaiah, though, we definitely do have an interest, and we should be ones to push back. With Jewish scholars, a lot of them have very, very strong views about the authorship of the Pentateuch. And so you'll see them argue very vociferously for this or that view. So again, having a personal stake in something is very important because we are likely to ask hard questions and push back on things. Whereas if we don't care about something, then people are just going to kind of do whatever they want, and it's probably going to go unchallenged. And here I have some recommended resources. The first is from Alvin Plantinga. He has an ebook online called Warranted Christian Belief. And in that book, he talks about the field of biblical studies and some of the assumptions and biases that inform the field. And we also have N.T. Wright. He's a New Testament scholar. His Christian Origins series begins in book 1 with 4 or 5 chapters that are really, really good for exploring questions of bias and assumptions and worldview. He also has a good book, it's a little bit shorter, called Scripture and the Authority of God that discusses these things. I've also created a blog post for Latter-day Saints called Spiritual Experiences, Motivated Reasoning, and Objectivity, and that further develops some of these ideas. Now let's talk about plausibility structures. Plausibility structures are the mental and cultural frameworks that determine what we find rational or believable. In other words, it's kind of like a box in my head. And that box is all of the things that I can believe, okay? If I can't believe something, then I can say it just doesn't fit in the box, all right? That's my plausibility structures. Our plausibility structures are influenced by a number of factors, like our culture, our life experiences, our neurological wiring, our worldview, and more. Whether or not something fits within a person's plausibility structures has no bearing on whether or not it is actually true. So, does not fit within my plausibility structures doesn't mean something's false. There are things that I am capable of believing that are false, and there are things that I am not capable of believing that are true. This is true of every human being on the planet. So our plausibility structures, again, they're very heavily shaped by our culture and our life experiences and other factors. Here's a quote from New Testament scholar Craig Keener in his book Miracles. He says, plausibility structures, what intuitively strikes us as rational, are culturally determined. While anti-supernaturalism remains a powerful traditional ideological force in Western culture, many cultures exist with worldviews that do not readily accommodate non-supernaturalism. and not necessarily because they lack appreciation for science or empirical inquiry. Suffice it to note here that, as we shall observe soon in greater detail, hundreds of millions of people in the world claim to have witnessed supernatural healings. Their plausibility structures, and in general those of the cultures where many of them live, differ from the plausibility structures of those who begin with Humean presuppositions. What does he mean by Humean presuppositions? Well, philosopher David Hume, long ago, developed a lengthy, involved argument against the existence of miracles. And it has been so influential for so long. A lot of people still nowadays operate from assumptions that he developed in his writings. So David Hume has been very influential in the spread of ideas of non-supernaturalism, the inability or the refusal to believe in miracles. Here's Walter Wink quoted in Craig Keener's book Miracles. He says, people with an attenuated sense of what is possible will bring that conviction to the Bible and diminish it by the poverty of their own experience. N.T. Wright says, thirdly, and most importantly, where I stand and the metaphorical lenses through which I look have a great deal to do with the communities to which I belong. Some things which I see in a particular way, I see thus because I belong to a particular human community, a network of family and friends. Some because I belong to a profession, some because I am an amateur musician, and so on. Every human community shares and cherishes certain assumptions, traditions, expectations, anxieties, and so forth, which encourage its members to construe reality in particular ways, and which create contexts within which certain kinds of statements are perceived as making sense. There is no such thing as the neutral or objective observer. Equally, there is no such thing as the detached observer. Now let's look at plausibility structures in practice in biblical studies. Here's a lengthy quote from scholar Richard Bauckham. And let's look at some particular elements of language that he uses talking about biblical scholarship. He says, I thought the Q hypothesis was the most convincing, explained satisfactorily. I have never found that hypothesis credible, very convincingly. What I found incredible, and should surely make it worth considering. You can see in each of these examples of language some kind of personal subjective judgments about what is believable. And that means he's offering us a glimpse into his plausibility structures and how those have affected his views of some questions in biblical scholarship. Now, here's another example of plausibility structures in practice, and this is an example from Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar, and he has been very influential in leading a lot of evangelicals in particular away from traditional belief in Christianity. He has written a lot of books undermining our understanding of the resurrection and miracle stories in the New Testament and so forth. And here is something interesting that he says. He says, if historians can only establish what probably happened, and miracles, by their definition, are the least probable occurrences, then more or less by definition, historians cannot establish that miracles have ever probably happened. Okay, the last part of what he says here is absolutely correct. Historians cannot establish that miracles have ever probably happened. Okay? If miracles happen, then the plausibility structures of historians have no bearing on that reality. Okay, it exists independently of what scholars are capable of believing. But the problem here is when Bart Ehrman talks about what probably happened and says miracles by their definition are the least probable occurrences. How would he calculate that they are less probable than other things, right? Probability is a mathematical discipline. It's not a subjective scholarly hunch based in worldview. And also, miracles by their definition, whose definition? People define the term miracle in very different ways, and the definition that we employ matters a lot in this instance. So again, here we have Bart Ehrman's plausibility structures at play, but he uses some creative ways to frame his plausibility structures as being other things, like questions of probability or definition. Here's a quote from J.J.M. Roberts. In his Isaiah commentary, he says, "I am amazed at the confidence with which scholars can reconstruct the editorial growth of a biblical book over the centuries with the barest minimum of actual evidence. It is not that I consider this process unimportant or uninteresting. It is more that I consider the details of this process to be largely unrecoverable. In general, in the absence of a trail of early datable and evolving manuscripts, the editorial process behind a particular book is both private and largely unrecoverable. Even with modern books that go through several editions, where each datable edition is available for comparative study, it is often difficult to determine why certain changes to the books took place. The confidence with which many modern scholars, who lack any datable manuscripts earlier than the final form of Isaiah, reconstruct hypothetical redactors living at particular periods, who make particular editorial changes in the service of some equally hypothetically reconstructed theological interest, strikes me as extreme hubris. If it were true, how could one know it?" I love this quote because here J.J.M. Roberts is saying that scholars have produced all of these elements of Isaiah scholarship that just simply do not fit within his plausibility structures. All these hypothetical redactors operating in the service of hypothetical ideological commitments. And he's basically telling us here that he finds it implausible. And I happen to agree with him. Much of these things that he's mentioning also do not fit within my plausibility structures. So let's look at revealing our plausibility structures. Key words and phrases that reveal our plausibility structures are things like, "I find it probable that blank." "The more likely scenario is blank." "Hard to imagine that blank." "It strains credulity to assert blank." Or blank seems to be more believable. "It makes more sense to assume that blank." "It is doubtful that blank." Or blank seems to indicate. When scholars use those kinds of phrases, they're not speaking from data. They're not speaking scientifically, okay? They're speaking from their own personal plausibility structures. This is super important to understand as we read biblical scholarship, especially Isaiah scholarship. And here's a resource that I've been mentioning, and I highly recommend it. It's Craig Keener's book on miracles. He has some very, very lengthy and thorough discussions of some of the philosophical arguments around miracles and plausibility structures. Concluding this section, bias is a normal fact of our intellectual life, and it is pervasive in biblical studies. Scholars see what they expect to see in questions of structure, authorship, and motivations of redactors, etc. A religious background can create biases in various directions, or can create a bias toward dogmatic thinking. A lack of interest in a question can amount to a form of bias toward group consensus. And plausibility structures determine what we find believable. Plausibility structures are informed by culture, life experience, and other factors. And all scholarship is shaped by a scholar's plausibility structures. This is very important to understand anytime we're reading biblical scholarship, and again, especially Isaiah scholarship. As we finish here, I want to remind viewers that all of these slides are available for download at Nauvoo Neighbor. If you find anything here useful, you can go there and download the slides and use these however you please. Thank you for joining me. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We hope this presentation has been informative. Our notes for this show are at Nauvoo Neighbor, and the link can be found in the show description. Also in the show description, we have a link to provide feedback. If you would like to suggest a topic for discussion, or if you would like to contribute a presentation on a topic of interest to you, let us know. Thanks again for joining us.